the Self-Worth Renaissance podcast. This is your host, Kirsten Van Wingerden. I am a licensed mental health counselor in Washington State. Please note that what is about to be discussed in this episode is not a replacement for individual therapy and is a collection of musings and thoughts on mental health topics. Welcome back to the Self-Worth Renaissance, the podcast where we rediscover our worth, embrace our imperfections, and step into the most empowered version of ourselves. I'm Kirsten Van Wingerden, your host and licensed mental health counselor, here to guide you through your journey towards self-love and confidence. Today, we're going to be talking about childhood trauma and how that impacts self-worth. So it's going to be a little bit of a heavier topic today. And childhood trauma is actually a specialty of my work in the therapeutic space, and I'm looking forward to sharing what I do know about it with you all today. I'm going to talk today about how it shows up in the home, how the body interprets trauma, and how this can impact self-worth as we age into our adult years. Trauma impacts us much more than we realize in our day-to-day lives. And we may find that we have responses to situations, people, or circumstances that feel completely out of our control at times. So first, we're going to define trauma. Then we'll talk about the various forms of trauma in childhood, how trauma erodes sense of self and identity, and then lastly, where to begin and how to build that self-awareness and self-confidence. And please note that I would like to include a sensitivity warning to today's episode. We're going to be talking about physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, not in specifics at all or detail, but these topics will be mentioned today. And because that is a little bit heavier, just kind of practice paying attention to how you feel listening to this podcast. And if you ever get overwhelmed, you can absolutely turn off this podcast. You do not owe me anything to listen through. If it feels like it's too much, it's just too much, and that's okay. And I'm actually going to lead us through a meditative practice before we start getting into the topic, just so that you can practice what grounding might look like before listening to something that might challenge you in some ways. So we're going to start by taking a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And you might notice where you're sitting in the room right now. And maybe you're driving or you're washing dishes, or maybe you're running around and just trying to complete all the errands and tasks that need to be done. But I just want you to notice your internal state right away. And I want you to just notice where your breath is coming from, whether that's from your diaphragm, your chest, or your throat. And to just notice without any judgment at all where that breath is coming from. And go ahead and just take a deep breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. And go ahead and picture a person, a place, or a thing that you feel gratitude towards right now. And you might imagine yourself expressing gratitude towards that person, place, or thing. And go ahead and just notice the difference in your body from when you started, any tension that was held, and to where you're at now after just tuning into your breath and practicing some gratitude. Notice that shift. And with that, know that you can access this state at any time that you might need to. As we're going through this podcast, that you can access peace and calm when you need. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right on in and start to talk about trauma. So to understand how trauma impacts self-worth, we need to first define what trauma is. Trauma is an emotional response to a distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It can manifest as acute trauma from a single event, such as a car accident or a really violent event that is witnessed. We think about war situations. Or there can also be complex trauma from prolonged or repeated exposure to stressful situations. Dr. Gabor Mate says it perfectly. Trauma occurs when choice and agency are taken away from us in situations where the choice or agency would threaten our safety. So trauma really occurs when, as humans, we lose the option to act in accordance with ourselves, act and make choices that are true to what we need in those moments. So if you've experienced any type of assault or any type of intimidation where you had to basically go into a response to make sure to make sure you were okay, such as like fawning, fight, flight, or dissociating, those are ways that we try to cope with trauma. And trauma doesn't always stem from really dramatic events. It can also come from subtle yet chronic experiences that undermine our sense of safety or worth. And it's really essential to recognize that trauma can be subjective, actually, which is kind of hard to understand at first. So what feels traumatic to one person may not be the same for another. And I don't want to go as far as when you're like, oh my gosh, it's so traumatic, I couldn't get my oat milk latte. Like, that is not what I'm saying at all. But we can have two people be in a car accident. Both are sitting in the back seat of the car, and the way their nervous system interprets it is totally different. And that can be because of genetics. It can be because of previous life experiences. It can be because of generational trauma, resilience factors. There can be a lot of reasons why one person might be really impacted, whereas another person can say, okay, that wasn't my fault, and move on with their lives. And I always love to point back to like the research of epigenetics, where we think about how do external environmental factors impact internal factors, such as genetics and how they change over time within family systems. And it's important to remember that while your grandmother was pregnant with your mom, you were an egg inside your mom, right? And I know that's like crazy to think about, but the trauma or any stress that your grandmother experienced in pregnancy actually impacts you. And these patterns and experiences go really deep within family systems. And I think it's really important to remember that because of those types of situations, sometimes we can be more susceptible to our bodies interpreting things as trauma, right? So, I think about there are experiences where children grow up and things were just really emotionally unpredictable, or there was a lot of shame, or there's a lot of children are to be seen and not heard. And that can actually be a cause of something called complex PTSD, which is like repetitive trauma over time that really erodes a sense of self and self-worth. And it really just makes a person's baseline just really wonky. It's hard to know, what is a true reality and what isn't. It's really tough. And, I think Esther Perel says it perfectly too. Like, dysfunction occurs within a family system when the focus is on the emotionally dysregulated parent and not on the children. And what do I mean when I say emotionally dysregulated parent? This is a parent that cannot manage their emotions. So the emotion comes and they can't ride the wave. And so they try to seek control over it, either by letting it consume them and acting in ways that are really scary towards other people, or they suppress it and numb it, and they basically become avoidant participants in the family. And it's important to remember that when children are born, the focus is meant to be on the children and not on the parents. And that does not mean that parents don't have needs or things that they need met as well, but the focus should be on how do we sacrifice and give the best for our children. And childhood is a crucial time for developing our sense of self and security. And when trauma occurs during these formative years, it can have a really profound impact on self-worth and knowing how to love ourselves. So we're going to talk about a few forms of childhood trauma next, such as emotional neglect and abuse, physical abuse, household dysfunction, and bullying that occurs outside of the home. So in terms of emotional neglect, when a child's emotional needs are consistently ignored or invalidated, they may grow up feeling unworthy of attention or love. And this can show up in various forms of attachment styles, which I think I'm going to do a totally separate episode on attachment styles at some point. But this can cause an anxious attachment, an avoidant, or a disorganized attachment. And anxious attachment would be like, I just want to prove to you that I'm worthy of your love. Avoidant would be, I don't want you anywhere near me because I don't trust that you can handle me or hold me well. And disorganized attachment is like that push and pull internal dynamic within self where it's like, I want you really close, but as soon as you're close, I can't trust you and I want you far away. And, obviously those are really basic explanations of that. And emotional neglect can also look like telling a child to just get over it, be stronger, or that they're quote unquote too sensitive, right? So it's like not giving any space for the emotions that are felt and telling the child to kind of just suppress and not feel that internal state. And emotional neglect is really tricky to identify later in life as well. Oftentimes, emotional neglect can occur when the primary caregiver was too depressed or too caught up in their inner world to be present with their children and to help their children, which is really sad when you think about it, that primary caregiver felt that way. We have a lot of empathy and a lot of compassion for that caregiver. And also, we can acknowledge at the same time that there was really significant impact on the child due to this. And, I think it is hard to identify later in life too, because oftentimes I'll have clients come into therapy and say, everything was great, right? Like it was perfect. I have nothing to complain about. And sometimes it can be because there's a part of the client that wants to protect their parents from any scrutiny, because that might have been their role within the family, or it's because they literally can't remember because everything was so suppressed, the emotions were so suppressed that the memory is repressed as well. One thing I always hear too is like stories of, my parents just like stayed in their bedroom. Like they never really were present, like they were really struggling mentally and they didn't know they were. And so they would be able to give me food and like give me meals, but outside of that, they were just absent. They were a shell of themselves. And it's like there's this wall between the child and the parent. And this can create a really anxious internal state for that child. And they find ways to try to cope with that then become other coping tools in adulthood that can sometimes not be very healthy. And it's tough because sure, the parent provided all of the physical needs of the child for their survival, but the emotional component, that nurture and care, was just never there, which taught the child to shut down their emotional needs and disconnect from their body, which can then lead to challenges in building fulfilling and genuine relationships later on in life, right? And it's kind of like that struggle and inability to identify who safe people are, and that's hard. And I think experiencing abuse can instill this belief that we are inherently flawed or deserving of mistreatment, or there's like this really deeply damaged self-worth. And of course, like physical abuse, pretty clear. Any action against your physical body that was done in anger and or in violence, not okay. Never. It is never okay for someone to touch you without your permission in a way that is harmful. Just in general, let's just say that, like, hands down, it's not okay for people to touch you without your consent. And, I think in some family systems, like, that's just normalized, unfortunately. And if that was your story, I'm so sorry. That should never have been part of your story. There is healing that can happen now. It is never too late to heal from those experiences. And emotional abuse can be a little bit trickier, right? Because there aren't physical marks from the abuse that happens, but it can look like manipulation, gaslighting, attacking character, name calling, and belittling, just to name a few. I think about, like, if someone's just like attacking you and coming at you and you can't get a word in for over 20 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes, like, something is wrong, right? Like, this is not a person that is trying to build connection or relationship with you. This is a person that is trying to harm you, whether they consciously or subconsciously are aware of that. And it doesn't really matter what the intention is. What matters is the impact of that abuse. And, it can really look like sometimes that parents will project their own emotional wounding and pain onto their children. And it's oftentimes the insecurities or the past wounding that the parents carry that they never had the resources or tools to get help with, or maybe they never wanted to change and it didn't matter. And that is hard to hear as well, especially if you look back on your childhood and there can be a sense of, like, why, right? We always want to find understanding and a reason why. And you might not have understanding or a reason why, but you do need to know how that impacts you. And I always remind clients too, like, if you leave a conversation with someone and you feel worse about yourself than going into it, and that becomes a repetitive pattern within a relationship, we really need to look at that dynamic because there's something unhealthy happening. The people in your life should be on your team and you're on their team and really try to help you become the best version of yourself. And if there's ever conflict, to approach that with love and care and compassion. Household dysfunction, right, can also create like a chronic state of anxiety or distorted self-concept, right? So if you grew up in a chaotic or unpredictable environment, like, that can really just be, oh my gosh, like, if things in my environment aren't going well, then I must be doing something wrong. So, if your parent was in or out of romantic relationships constantly, maybe you were moving all the time, maybe financial or food insecurity was present, or you had a caregiver that battled addiction, that can really impact your ability to feel secure and stable. Sometimes children will internalize that sense of instability to mean that they are the cause of the instability, and they try to be more secure and small, like as small as possible, so that they don't add stress to the turmoil that's already being felt. And you can imagine what that looks like in adulthood, right? That's just like this like disconnection from self and never having needs and just trying to be as amiable as possible. And lastly, I think about bullying, right? And how that erodes self-esteem. And it leaves scars. When peers are really harmful to kids, in their class, that can just cause this sense of like, I will never belong. There's something wrong with me. And gosh, I just think that, kids tend to reflect the environment at home. They tend to do the thing that they were taught, right? And we can have compassion for that as we get into adulthood, but it's also important to look at what are those negative beliefs that maybe I'm still carrying with me about myself, even though that was a long time ago. And is there a way that I can forgive those people that harmed me and wronged me? Trauma doesn't leave just emotional wounds. It can fundamentally impact how we see ourselves. And when we experience trauma, especially as a child, it can lead to these 4 things. And just know that we're focusing in on self-worth. This isn't the whole picture, right? There's a lot more that it can lead to. But the first thing I think about is fragmented identity. So trauma can cause a disconnection from parts of ourselves, and we can suppress memories or emotions, and it leads to a fragmented sense of who we are. So maybe there is a part of us that is really outgoing and confident and believes that we are valuable. And then there's another part that is really shy and it's hard for that part of us to like believe that we belong in a room. And it can kind of feel like we oscillate between these 2 parts of ourselves. It's either like it's really good or it's really bad, right? And that can cause a lot of anxiety and tension. And with fragmented identity, it can be hard to make decisions where we don't rely on other people to make decisions for us, because it's hard to trust what version of ourselves is the true version of who we are. And that can just be one snippet of what a fragmented identity can look like. Another thing too that comes up is negative core beliefs. So trauma often fosters negative core beliefs such as I'm not enough, I'm unlovable, or I'm unsafe, or maybe I'm even too much. And these beliefs shape our behaviors, our choices, and our relationships. And if you think about it, if you're coming at the world with a lens that I'm too much, think about all the opportunities that you choose not to take or turn yourself down to because you don't think that you have a seat at the table. Or if you have, or you don't believe you have a seat at the table. And if you think I'm unlovable, maybe you choose partners who don't love you. You choose people that don't really respect you or value you or see you as lovable, right? Because it's like this internalized state of like, well, if I don't love myself, then how could someone else? And those core beliefs really do impact us as adults. And it's so sad when young children believe these things about themselves and grow up into adults who continue to believe that. And thirdly, hypervigilance and people pleasing can be another way that trauma impacts us. So to avoid further trauma, a lot of people develop hypervigilance or people pleasing tendencies, kind of like shaping yourself around other people. And that can really disconnect us from like our authentic needs and desires. And maybe what we need or desire is not popular. Or maybe it isn't accepted fully within reason, right? Like morally within reason. You know what I'm saying? But like, I don't know. Maybe you live in a community where like being active isn't normal, but you love being active. Or maybe you are a woman who loves to go and be out in the backcountry and you've been told your whole life that women don't do that. Like maybe you should go do that. Right? And then, hypervigilance is just like, okay, I'm going to make sure that I meet everyone else's needs before I meet my own needs, or I'm going to anticipate everything that could go wrong so that I feel safe. And that's exhausting. Let's be real. It's just totally exhausting. And of course, trauma really can diminish self-worth. It can lead to a pervasive sense of unworthiness where the person feels undeserving of happiness, success, or love. Yeah, trauma really does impact who we are. Let's talk about how to rebuild a sense of self and self-worth and where we go from there. So here are the 6 things that I would do to rebuild a sense of self and self-worth once acknowledging that trauma has impacted the way that you see yourself. The first thing I would do is recognize and validate your experience. So acknowledge that your trauma is real, acknowledge how it affected you, and remember that validation is the first step in healing, which can be one of the hardest steps because oftentimes with childhood trauma, there was not very much validation. So it can feel like using a muscle that feels wrong, right? It's kind of like, oh, I don't know if I can validate what this feels like. Is this okay that I feel this way? And I promise you, if you are feeling it, it's real, right? Your emotions are real. Your behaviors are something you can have agency over, though. Behaviors and emotions are two different things. The second thing I would do is cultivate self-compassion. So replace that self-criticism with self-compassion. Speak to yourself with kindness as you would to a dear friend, and understand that healing is going to take some time. I would thirdly suggest seeking out therapy. I think a mental health professional can really help you unpack and process trauma in a way that is safe for you. And I would recommend looking for a therapist like myself that is trained in EMDR or lifespan integration. And I would really recommend someone who has a trauma-informed lens where they have gone through training or somatic work training to understand how to support clients well. So I think that can be really effective. Fourth, reconnect with your body. Trauma often disconnects us from our bodies. So practices like yoga, mindfulness, or grounding exercises can really help you reestablish a sense of safety within yourself. For me, I have to be physically active in order to process what I'm feeling. So running is a huge tool for me, and yoga is as well. Or even just going on a walk, right? I have to do those things. Otherwise, those emotions and experiences can get really stuck in me, and it's hard for me to identify what's going on. So I highly recommend having some type of movement practice that serves your body well. Fifthly, I don't know if fifthly is a word, maybe fifth? I don't know, but this is point 5. Establish some boundaries, right? You can listen to one of my other podcast episodes on boundaries and how to set them, but setting boundaries is crucial to protecting your healing process and maintaining a sense of self. You really need to learn to say no and prioritize your own well-being. And number 6, build a support system. Surround yourself with people who lift you up and understand you. Healing is easier when you're not doing it alone. And I have one more point because I have lots of things to say on this topic, and I'm trying to keep it as short and succinct as possible. But everything comes back to love and connection. And Dr. Frank Anderson, he does a lot of work on trauma, and he's one of the foremost experts, and he really emphasizes this. And I can tell you that within my own work in clinical settings and in my own personal experiences, that love and connection are the ways to heal trauma. It is all about knowing that we are not alone in the midst of all of this. And we have others who see us for who we are and accept the real version of who we are. All the parts of us that are messy or unkind or harmful or loving and caring, we all have parts of us that are on a spectrum, right? And trauma builds these walls around our hearts and our true personalities. And it's about finding ways to let that wall down with people that are safe. Building self-worth is about creating a new narrative, one where you are not defined by your trauma, but by your resilience and your capacity to heal. So thank you for joining me in this important conversation about trauma and self-worth today. I want to remind you that healing is not linear, and it's okay to take it one step at a time. You are more than your trauma. You are worthy of love and peace and happiness. If you found this episode helpful, please follow, rate, subscribe, write a comment, follow the Instagram page. I'm now on YouTube as well. I'm on Apple Podcasts. I'm everywhere. So just share it with someone who you think might need it. And don't forget to leave a review. I really am hopeful that this can become a community where other people don't feel alone, and we can all kind of share our stories together and find solace. So I would just leave you with this. Your trauma does not define your self-worth. Those are two separate things. And I just want to remind you that you are enough just as you are. So take care. I'll see you next time.